They rode out of Cheyenne into the frozen night. Abigail gripped the stranger's coat, her heart pounding. She'd been silent for 6 years, sold by her father for $50. Deaf, they all said. Then the mountain man leaned back his mouth inches from her ear. "I know you can hear me, little bird." Every muscle in her body froze. This is the story of how a lie meant to survive became the truth that saved 2 lives. The air inside the Iron Horse Saloon smelled of failure and desperation. It was October 14th, 1882, and the autumn wind that rattled the wooden shutters of Cheyenne carried with it the promise of a brutal Wyoming winter. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke, cheap rye whiskey, and the sour stench of men who had given up washing weeks ago. The piano player in the corner hammered out a discordant melody, his fingers stumbling over keys that had never been properly tuned. At the center table, beneath a cluster of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across scarred oak, sat Silas Hayes. He was 45 years old, though whiskey and vice had withered him into something that looked closer to 60. His hands trembled as he stared at the cards fanned before him. Kings over 9s. A full house. It should have been enough. It should have saved him. But Silas Hayes had nothing left to bet. Across from him sat Clayton Garrett, a man whose reputation preceded him like the smell of gunpowder. He worked as an enforcer for one of the territory's cattle barons, and his cold eyes had watched men die without blinking. Tonight those eyes were fixed on the pile of gold coins stacked in the center of the table coins that Silas could not match. Standing behind Silas's chair, rigid as a fence post, was his daughter. Abigail Hayes was 19 years old, though malnutrition made her appear younger. Her dress was faded calico, patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes were locked on the floorboards as if she could disappear into the grain of the wood itself. To the people of Cheyenne, Abigail was the mute ghost. The girl who hadn't spoken a word in 6 years, not since the typhoid fever took her mother and left her alone with a father who valued cards more than kin. Silas had told everyone she was deaf and dumb, a burden he carried out of Christian charity. It was a lie, but it was a lie that had kept Abigail alive. "Call or fold, Jed." Clayton growled, his voice like gravel grinding in a butter churn. He tapped one thick finger on the pile of coins, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Even the piano player had stopped mid-chord, sensing something darker than money changing hands. Silas swallowed hard. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill. He had a full house. He knew he could win, but he had no coin, no gold, nothing of value except the worn boots on his feet and the girl standing behind him. His eyes darted around the room, desperate and wild, until they landed on Abigail. "I have no coin," Silas stammered the words thick with whiskey courage, "but I have labor." He grabbed Abigail's wrist and yanked her forward. She stumbled, but made no sound. Not a gasp, not a whimper. Her face remained a mask of terrified neutrality, the kind of stillness that came from years of practice. "She's strong," Silas slurred, pulling her closer to the lamplight like a farmer displaying livestock at auction. "She cooks, she cleans, she don't talk back because she can't hear a damn thing. Deaf as a post, this one." The saloon had gone silent. Men who moments before had been laughing and gambling now stared with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Selling a daughter wasn't unheard of in the harshest corners of the frontier, where survival ground people down to their basest instincts. But the desperation in Silas's voice, the casual cruelty with which he offered up his own blood, turned stomachs even in this rough crowd. Clayton looked Abigail up and down with the cold assessment of a man evaluating a workhorse. She kept her eyes down, her breathing shallow. Inside her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird beating against cage bars. "I ain't running a nursery, Hayes," Clayton said with a sneer. "I want my money, not some half-starved girl who can't hear when I tell her to fetch water." "She's worth $50 in labor," Silas screamed, his voice cracking with the shrill edge of a man who knew he was drowning. "Take her. She's deaf. Take her and wipe the slate clean." Clayton studied his cards. 4 jacks. He knew he was going to win. He looked at the girl again, seeing not a person but a servant he could abuse and discard when she no longer amused him. "Fine," he said, throwing his cards down with a decisive snap. "The girl covers the 50. Show your hand." Silas slammed his cards onto the table triumphantly, but his face fell as Clayton revealed the 4 jacks, laying them out one by one with deliberate slowness. "You lose, old man." Clayton stood his chair, scraping back across the wooden floor. The sound made Abigail flinch. It was a microscopic movement, barely perceptible, but she couldn't stop the instinctive response. Her body had been trained by 6 years of violence to react to sudden sounds, sudden movements, the sudden shift in air that preceded a blow. Before Clayton's hand could close around her wrist, a shadow fell across the table. It was massive, blocking out the lamplight and plunging the poker game into sudden dimness. Every man in the saloon looked up. Standing there, filling the doorway like a force of nature given human form, was a man who looked more like a grizzly bear walking on 2 legs than anything civilized. He wore a coat made of buffalo hide, dark and heavy, still carrying the smell of the high mountains. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with streaks of gray that caught the lamplight. He stood nearly 6 feet 7 inches tall, and his shoulders were so broad he had to turn slightly sideways to fit through the doorframe. This was Samuel Thornton. The locals called him Bear. He lived high in the Laramie Mountains, trapping furs and coming down to civilization only when his supplies ran low or the isolation became too heavy even for him to bear. Most men gave him a wide berth, not out of fear exactly, but out of respect for something wild that had chosen to wear human skin. Samuel didn't look at Clayton. He didn't acknowledge Silas. His dark eyes, intelligent and assessing, fixed on Abigail. He saw things other men missed. He saw the way her pulse hammered visibly in her neck. He saw the way her pupils dilated when Clayton's chair scraped the floor. He saw the almost imperceptible lean away from the men around her, the body language of prey trying to make itself smaller. "The debt is 50, Samuel said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, resonating in the chests of everyone nearby, the kind of voice that could carry across mountain valleys or quiet a room without raising in volume. "Stay out of this, mountain man." Clayton warned, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. "This is business." Samuel reached into his coat with movements that were slow and deliberate, giving no man reason to draw on him. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch and slammed it onto the table. It landed with the distinctive clink of gold, the sound that made every gambler's head turn. "That's 3 ounces of raw dust," Samuel said, "worth 60 at the assayer's office. I'm buying the debt." Silas's eyes bulged with greed. His hand shot out toward the pouch like a striking snake. "Done. Sold." Clayton looked furious, his jaw working as he ground his teeth. But he wasn't stupid. Samuel Thornton had a reputation for crushing skulls with his bare hands. There were stories whispered in saloons from Cheyenne to Deadwood about men who had tried to ambush the bear on mountain trails. Those men were never found, or if they were found in pieces. Clayton spat on the floor, a gesture of contempt, then scooped up his winnings and holstered his gun. "Have it your way, Bear, but don't expect conversation from that one. Girl's broken, deaf and dumb as they come." Silas was already counting the gold dust, his fingers trembling with anticipation. He didn't even look at his daughter. "Good riddance," he muttered. "Useless mouth to feed anyway." Samuel ignored them both. He stepped toward Abigail, and she looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were wide, the blue-gray color of storm clouds over the prairie. Fear lived in those eyes, but it was a different kind of fear than she'd shown Clayton. This was the fear of the unknown, of standing at the edge of a cliff and not knowing if the ground below was solid or if there was nothing but empty air. Samuel gestured toward the door. A simple movement, no words needed. Abigail hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. She had no choice but to follow. The transaction was complete. She belonged to him now, purchased for $60 in gold dust, same as a good rifle or a winter's worth of supplies. They walked out of the Iron Horse Saloon into the biting cold of an October night. The wind howled down the main street of Cheyenne, kicking up dust and tumbleweeds carrying the smell of coming snow. Abigail wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little against the cold. Samuel walked to his horse, a massive Clydesdale mix named Thunder. The animal was the size of a draft horse, with a coat the color of dark mahogany and white feathering around its enormous hooves. Samuel mounted with practiced ease, settling into the saddle as if he were part of the horse itself. He reached down one scarred, bark-rough hand toward Abigail. She took it. His palm was warm despite the cold calloused from years of hard work, but gentle as he pulled her up behind him. He swung her onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing at all. Abigail settled onto the saddle, gripping the rough buffalo fur of his coat for balance, expecting him to kick the horse into a gallop and leave Cheyenne behind in a cloud of dust. Instead, Samuel turned his head slightly. He didn't shout over the wind. He didn't use hand signs. He leaned back, his mouth inches from her ear, concealed by the high collar of his coat, so that no one watching from the saloon windows could see his lips move. "I saw you flinch when the chair scraped," he whispered, his voice low and terrifyingly calm. "And I saw your eyes widen when I said the word gold." Abigail's heart stopped. Every muscle in her body locked. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but grip his coat harder, her knuckles turning white with the force of it. "I know you can hear me, little bird." The words hung in the cold air between them, a secret shared and a truth revealed. Samuel didn't wait for a reply. He kicked Thunder into motion, and they thundered out of Cheyenne, heading straight for the dark, unforgiving peaks of the Laramie Mountains. Abigail was no longer a prisoner of her father, but now she was trapped in a far more dangerous game, a lie that had already been discovered, a silence that had been shattered before she'd even had a chance to decide whether to speak. The journey up the mountain was a grueling test of endurance that stretched across 3 days and pushed both horse and riders to their limits. The air grew thinner with every mile they climbed, colder and sharper each breath, like swallowing knives made of ice. The trail narrowed as they ascended, winding between pines so tall their tops disappeared into low-hanging clouds. For the first 6 hours, Abigail maintained her act with the discipline of a soldier under siege. She did not speak. She did not gasp when Thunder stumbled on loose rocks, when the trail brought them within inches of sheer drops that plunged hundreds of feet into darkness. She stared at the back of Samuel's head, her mind racing faster than the horse's hooves. Who was this man? Why had he paid so much for her, and if he knew she could hear, why hadn't he forced her to admit it yet? Samuel Thornton was a puzzle wrapped in buffalo hide and silence. Most men Abigail had known filled every moment with noise. Her father, the gamblers, the drifters who passed through Cheyenne, they all talked constantly, boasted, complained, cursed the world and their place in it. Samuel was different. He was part of the landscape itself, moving with a deliberate economy of motion and sound that felt ancient, elemental. When he stopped to water Thunder at a creek that cut through a grove of aspen trees, he checked Abigail's boots without a word, making sure they were laced tight against the creeping cold. But he didn't try to make eye contact. He didn't explain where they were going or what he planned to do with her. He simply moved through the tasks of survival with the quiet competence of a man who had spent years alone. They made camp the first night in a small clearing sheltered from the wind by a natural wall of rock. The sun had set, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. Samuel built a fire with quick efficiency, and soon the smell of burning pine filled the air, mixing with the sharper scent of the rabbit he'd snared earlier. Abigail sat by the fire, wrapping her thin arms around herself, watching as Samuel skinned the rabbit with movements that were precise and surgical. His knife moved with the confidence of long practice, and within minutes he had the animal cleaned and ready to cook. "Salt," Samuel said suddenly. He didn't look at her. He spoke the word clearly at a normal conversational volume, as if speaking to himself or the fire or the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Abigail was staring at the flames, watching them dance and flicker. The salt pouch was to her right near the saddlebags within easy reach. Her instinct, trained by years of being helpful to avoid beatings, was to reach for it immediately. Her hand actually twitched, lifting an inch off her knee before she caught herself. She forced herself to scratch her leg instead, as if the movement had been nothing more than an itch. She kept her gaze fixed on the flames, her face a careful blank, feigning total ignorance of the request. Samuel chuckled. It was a dry, rusty sound like a door that hadn't been opened in years, finally swinging on its hinges. He reached over, grabbed the salt himself, and seasoned the meat before skewering it over the fire. "You're good," he murmured almost to himself. "Better than the poker players down in town." He paused, watching the fat from the rabbit drip onto the coals and hiss. "But you breathe different when you're listening. You hold your breath to catch the sound." Abigail didn't react. She couldn't. If she admitted she could hear, she lost her only defense. If she was deaf, she was useless, and perhaps he would let her go, send her away, give her a chance to disappear into some other town where no one knew her father's name. If she was a liar, she was dangerous, and dangerous things didn't survive long in the wilderness. Samuel handed her a portion of the meat on a tin plate. She took it, nodding a silent thank you, keeping her eyes down. "My brother Warren," Samuel said, staring into the fire as he took a bite of rabbit, chewing slowly. He was deaf, lost his hearing to cannon fire in the war back in '64. Abigail's grip on her plate tightened, but she didn't look up. "I learned to talk with my hands for him," Samuel continued. "Learned to watch his eyes, read the way he moved." He looked at Abigail, then his dark eyes piercing through the firelight. Warren had a look in his eyes, a peacefulness, because the world was quiet for him. No shouting, no gunfire, no chaos, just silence. He took another bite, never breaking eye contact. "You don't have that look, Abigail. Your eyes are loud. They're scanning, waiting, watching for the next shoe to drop." Abigail ate her food mechanically, chewing and swallowing without tasting. Her heart pounded against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack bone. She wanted to scream at him to stop, to leave her alone, to let her keep her silence. She wanted to ask him where they were going, what he wanted from her, if he planned to hurt her or sell her to someone worse than Clayton Garrett. But she chewed in silence, and when the meal was done, she curled up near the fire on the bedroll he'd laid out for her, and she stared at the stars through the aspen branches until exhaustion finally dragged her under. The second day was harder. A blizzard threatened from the north, turning the sky the color of slate, and bringing with it a wind that cut through clothing like it wasn't even there. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and soon ice crystals were whipping through the air, stinging exposed skin like needles. They reached a place Samuel called Dead Man's Drop just after noon. The trail narrowed to barely 4 feet wide, with a sheer drop of 300 feet on one side and a vertical cliff wall on the other. The path was slick with ice, hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. Samuel dismounted his boots, crunching on the frozen ground. "We walk from here," he said, not to Abigail, but to Thunder, running a hand down the horse's neck to calm him. But he knew she heard. He always knew. He led Thunder by the reins, taking each step with careful deliberation. Abigail walked behind the massive horse, pressing herself against the cliff wall, trying to become part of the stone. The wind was deafening here, howling through the narrow pass with a fury that felt personal, angry. Perhaps a deaf person could feel the vibration of it in their bones, but Abigail heard every shriek, every roar, and it filled her with a terror that made her legs shake. Suddenly Thunder stumbled. A patch of black ice lurked beneath the snow, invisible until it was too late. The horse's rear leg slid out over the edge of the trail, and 3/4 of a ton of animal weight shifted in the wrong direction. Thunder panicked, whinnying in fear, his eyes rolling white as he scrabbled for purchase on the ice-slick rock. The saddlebags swung violently, pulled by gravity toward the abyss. One of them caught on a jutting rock and tore, spilling supplies into the void. Cans of beans, a spare shirt, a coil of rope all tumbled into darkness. "Whoa, easy!" Samuel roared, digging his heels into the trail, using all his massive strength to pull Thunder's head toward the wall. His voice was thunder itself, commanding and desperate at once. But the weight was too much. Thunder was sliding, and worse, a rope from the saddlebag had somehow snagged around Samuel's wrist, looping tight as the bag swung out over the drop. If the horse went over, Samuel was going with him. "Let go," Abigail wanted to scream. The words burned in her throat like acid. She could see it happening in slow motion, could see the exact moment when Samuel's boots would lose their grip on the ice, and he would be yanked over the edge, pulled down by the weight of the falling horse, his body smashing against rocks on the way down, until there was nothing left but broken meat at the bottom of the canyon. Samuel grunted, his face turning red with exertion. The muscles in his arms stood out like steel cables, every vein visible as he fought against physics and gravity. But he was losing. Inch by inch, he was sliding toward the edge. Without thinking, Abigail lunged forward. She didn't grab Samuel. She couldn't pull his weight any more than she could move a mountain. Instead, she grabbed a jagged rock from the trail about the size of her fist, sharp enough to cut her palm as she gripped it. She dropped to her knees and slammed it into the ice behind Thunder's rear hoof, creating a chock, a wedge, something for the desperate animal to push against. Then she grabbed Thunder's tail with both hands and yanked with every ounce of strength she possessed, pulling the horse's hindquarters toward the wall. "Hup! Get up!" The words ripped out of her throat before she could stop them. They were clear, high-pitched, undeniable. A command shouted with the full force of her terror and desperation. "Get up!" Thunder's hoof found purchase on the rock she'd wedged into place. The horse surged forward with a desperate lunge, hauling itself and the entangled Samuel back onto safe ground. The sudden shift in weight sent Samuel falling backward onto the snow-covered trail, gasping for air, the rope finally coming loose from his wrist. Thunder stood there, shivering, head down, sides heaving. The horse was safe. Samuel was safe. But between the man and the woman, there was a sudden absolute silence more profound than the howling wind. Abigail stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with the horror of what she'd done. She had spoken. She had shouted orders. The charade was over. 6 years of carefully maintained silence shattered in a single moment of desperation. Samuel sat up slowly, brushing snow from his beard, with hands that trembled slightly, whether from exertion or shock she couldn't tell. He looked at Thunder, checked the horse over with his eyes to make sure no legs were broken. Then he looked at the edge of the cliff, at the void that had almost swallowed them both. Finally, he looked at Abigail. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant like a man who'd won a bet or caught someone in a lie. He looked sad, deeply, profoundly sad. "You saved my life," he said quietly, the wind snatching his words almost before Abigail could hear them. Abigail backed away, pressing herself against the rock wall, shaking her head violently. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg him not to hurt her, to explain that it had been instinct, that she hadn't meant to reveal herself. But fear clamped her throat shut again. After 6 years of silence, the words wouldn't come when she tried to summon them deliberately. She reverted to the only safety she knew. She pointed to her ear and shook her head, a desperate, pathetic attempt to take it back, to convince him he'd been mistaken, that the wind had played tricks, that she'd made sounds, but not words. Samuel stood up, towering over her, and Abigail flinched, but he didn't strike her. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement so she could see it coming, and gently pulled the hood of her coat up around her face, protecting her ears from the biting frost. "We have 5 miles to the cabin," he said, his voice void of the earlier teasing. "All business now, all survival. We can talk about your voice when we get there, or we can stay silent." He leaned in his face, inches from hers, his breath making clouds in the frozen air between them. "But know this, Abigail Hayes, I ain't your father, and I ain't Clayton Garrett. You don't have to hide in the quiet with me." He turned and grabbed Thunder's reins, checking the horse over more thoroughly now, adjusting the remaining saddlebag, making sure everything was secure. "Let's go." Abigail stood frozen for a long moment, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. He hadn't punished her. He hadn't gloated or threatened or demanded she explain herself. He had simply offered her a choice. For the first time in 6 years, the silence wasn't a prison. It was a question hanging in the cold mountain air, waiting for her answer. She wiped her face with numb fingers, stepped away from the wall, and followed the giant man into the snow. The cabin wasn't the hovel Abigail had expected. Nestled in a natural cradle of granite beneath the shadow of Laramie Peak, it was more fortress than home. Built from huge pine logs, chinked with river stone and mud, it sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating a banked fire still burning inside. When Samuel kicked the heavy oak door open, a wave of trapped heat washed over them. The smell hit Abigail immediately, dried sage and wood smoke and old paper, a combination that spoke of habitation by someone who cared about more than mere survival. Samuel lit a kerosene lamp, and yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing an interior that shocked Abigail into stillness. There were no piles of rotting furs or gnawed bones. No filth, no chaos, none of the squalor she'd expected from a mountain hermit. Instead, she saw a massive stone hearth that dominated one wall, its mantel carved with intricate designs of bears and eagles. A sturdy table with 2 chairs sat near the fire. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars of preserved food, dried herbs hanging from hooks, and most surprising of all, books. Dozens of books. Leather-bound volumes standing in neat rows. Abigail could make out titles in the lamplight. Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, the complete works of Shakespeare, Homer's Odyssey, Paradise Lost. These weren't dime novels or penny dreadfuls. These were serious books, the kind educated men in Boston and New York read. "This is it," Samuel grunted, moving to the hearth and stirring the embers of a fire that had been carefully banked to last his absence. Flames began to lick up around fresh wood, he added, casting dancing light across the room. Abigail stood by the door, shivering in her wet coat, clutching her thin shawl. She felt like an intruder in a library that happened to have a bed in the corner. "There's a cot in this back corner," Samuel said, pointing to a small alcove separated from the main room by a hung bear pelt that served as a curtain. "It's got clean wool blankets. You sleep there. I take the floor by the fire." He paused, feeding another log to the flames. "It's better for my back anyway." He was establishing boundaries immediately. No threats, no demands for her to warm his bed, no expectations beyond the basic division of space. He treated her like a guest he hadn't really wanted to invite but was too polite to turn away. For the next 3 weeks, a strange and heavy routine settled over the cabin. The blizzard that had threatened on the trail arrived in full force, burying the world outside in 6 feet of snow. They were trapped, isolated from civilization by walls of white that made travel impossible. Inside the cabin, time took on a different quality, measured not in hours, but in the rhythm of meals and sleep, and the sound of wind battering the shutters. Abigail maintained her silence, but the dynamic had shifted since the incident on the cliff. She knew that he knew. He knew that she knew he knew. It was a dizzying game of chess played without pieces where every glance and gesture carried weight. She took over the cooking. It was the only way she could pay him back for the food and warmth, without speaking the only way to be useful and therefore less likely to be cast out into the snow. She found his supplies, flour and dried venison, a sack of withered onions, and she worked small miracles. She baked biscuits that were fluffy instead of rock hard. She made stews rich with flavor, using the dried herbs she found hanging from the rafters, crushing them between her fingers and adding them to the pot with the instinct her mother had taught her. One evening in mid-November, when the wind was screaming outside and rattling the heavy shutters, the tension reached a breaking point. They were eating dinner in silence. Samuel was reading a copy of Great Expectations, his large finger tracing the lines as he read, his lips moving slightly with the words. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the storm raged. "You hum when you cook," Samuel said without looking up from his book. Abigail froze her spoon halfway to her mouth. Samuel turned a page, seemingly absorbed in Dickens. "It's a low sound like a bee in a jar. Unconscious, probably. My brother Warren used to make noises, too. Deaf folks do that because they can't hear how loud they are, can't modulate." He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto hers across the table. "But you, Abigail, you hum on key. You were humming the tune the piano player was banging out at the Iron Horse the night I bought you." Abigail's hand trembled. She lowered the spoon slowly, carefully placing it in her bowl with a soft clink that sounded loud in the sudden quiet. "Why do you keep it up?" Samuel asked, his voice dropping to that low, rumbling whisper that seemed to vibrate in the chest. "There's nobody here but the wind and the wolves. Is my voice so terrible that you can't answer it?" Abigail stared at him. Her throat felt constricted tight with 6 years of unspoken words, 6 years of fear and survival, and the learned helplessness of a child who'd discovered that silence was safety. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak. It was that she had forgotten how to trust her own voice, forgotten how to believe that words wouldn't bring pain. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud across the wooden floor, and went to the wash basin. She grabbed a plate and began scrubbing it with aggressive force, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with emotion she couldn't name. She heard Samuel sigh a heavy sound like wind through a canyon. She heard the chair move, heard his heavy footsteps approaching. He stopped 3 feet behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like heat from a fire, but far enough that he wasn't trapping her, wasn't forcing proximity. "I was a sheriff once," he said to her back. "In Kansas before the war changed things. Before I changed." Abigail paused in her scrubbing her hands still in the soapy water. "I interrogated liars, thieves, killers." Samuel continued, his voice steady and calm. "I learned to tell the difference between a lie told for profit and a lie told for survival. You're holding on to that silence like it's a shield, Abigail. But shields get heavy. Sooner or later you have to put them down, or the weight breaks you." He waited. When she didn't turn around, didn't respond, he walked back to the fire. She heard him settle into his chair, heard the rustle of pages as he picked up his book again. "I won't ask again," he said, and there was finality in his tone that felt like a door closing. "You speak when you're ready. But until then, don't think I don't see you." That night, lying on the cot in the small alcove behind the bear pelt curtain, Abigail stared up at the rough timber ceiling. She could hear Samuel's breathing from the main room, deep and steady, the breathing of a man who slept with the confidence of someone who feared nothing the night could bring. She whispered one word so softly that even the silence couldn't catch it, so quietly that it was more breath than sound. "Samuel." It felt strange on her tongue, heavy and real, like something with substance and weight. She said it again, still just a whisper, testing the shape of it. "Samuel." The name of the man who had bought her but hadn't owned her, who had discovered her secret, but hadn't punished her, who had offered her a choice instead of a command. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, she didn't dream of her father's fists or Clayton Garrett's cold eyes. She dreamed of a voice, her own voice, speaking words she hadn't yet learned to say. December came to the mountains with a cold so profound it seemed to freeze time itself. The snow was packed hard enough to walk on without sinking, creating a strange landscape where the world existed in shades of white and blue and the pale gray of winter sky. Inside the cabin, life had softened. The sharp edges of awkwardness between Samuel and Abigail had begun to wear down, smoothed by routine and the quiet comfort of shared space. Abigail had developed her own language of communication. She would tap the table twice when dinner was ready. She would point to the wood bin when it was running low, and Samuel would pull on his coat without complaint and venture out into the cold to split more logs. She mended his clothes with the skill her mother had taught her, her needle moving in quick, efficient stitches that transformed torn shirts and holed socks into serviceable garments once more. In turn, Samuel began to read to her in the evenings. He never asked if she wanted it, never sought permission. He would simply clear his throat after dinner, open whatever book he'd selected, and begin. His voice, usually so rough and economical, took on a rhythmic, soothing cadence as he read. He worked his way through the Odyssey, his deep voice bringing to life the story of monsters and gods and the long journey home. Abigail would sit by the fire pretending to focus on her mending, but she listened to every word. She let his voice wash over her, vibrating through the floorboards, filling the spaces between the logs. Sometimes she would close her eyes and just listen, and in those moments the silence she'd worn like armor for 6 years felt less like protection and more like a prison she'd built for herself. One morning, Samuel geared up to check his trap line. The weather had cleared enough for travel, and they needed fresh meat. He pulled on his buffalo coat and strapped the heavy Colt Navy revolver to his hip, a weapon he rarely wore inside the cabin. "Be back by sundown," he told her, adjusting his hat. "Keep the door barred. The wolves are hungry this year. I saw tracks near the creek yesterday, a whole pack by the size of it." Abigail nodded, watching from the doorway, as he trudged out into the white expanse, a solitary black figure against the blinding snow. Thunder stayed behind this time. The horse needed rest, and Samuel could move faster on snowshoes across the frozen landscape. By sundown, Samuel hadn't returned. By the time the moon rose high and pale, casting blue shadows across the snow, fear began to gnaw at Abigail's stomach like a living thing. Samuel was more capable than any man she'd ever known. But the mountains didn't care about capability. An avalanche could bury the strongest man. A hidden crevasse could swallow him whole. A pack of timber wolves, desperate and hungry, could bring down even a giant. She paced the small cabin, her footsteps wearing a path in the wooden floor. She checked the fire, adding logs to keep it burning bright, a beacon in case he was lost and looking for the way home. She checked the window, peering through the gaps in the shutters at the moonlit wilderness beyond. At midnight, she heard it. Not the rhythmic crunch of boots through snow, but a dragging sound, heavy and labored. Then a thud against the door, followed by silence. Abigail threw the bolt and hauled the heavy door open. Samuel collapsed across the threshold. He was conscious, but his face was gray, his lips tinged blue with cold. His left leg was a mess of blood-soaked denim-dark stains that looked black in the lamplight. He clutched at it with one hand, the other braced against the doorframe to keep himself upright. "Bear trap," he gritted out through chattering teeth. His whole body shook with violent tremors. "Hidden under a drift, not mine, some poacher's rig." Abigail didn't freeze. The panic that usually paralyzed her vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity she'd never experienced before. She grabbed Samuel under the arms. He was dead weight, nearly 260 pounds of muscle and bone, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She dragged him toward the fire, her boots slipping on the wooden floor, her muscles screaming with the effort. She grunted and strained, pulling him inch by inch, until finally he was close enough to the hearth to benefit from its heat. She kicked the door shut and latched it, shutting out the wind and the dark. "Whiskey," Samuel groaned, his head lolling back against the floor. "And the knife." Abigail worked fast. She knew what needed to be done. Her mother had been a seamstress, but before that she'd helped the town doctor when injuries came in from ranch accidents or bar fights. Catherine Hayes had taught her daughter the basics of field medicine in a world where doctors were scarce and help was often hours or days away. Abigail stripped the heavy coat off Samuel's body, her hands moving with purpose. She cut away the pant leg with his hunting knife, the fabric falling away to reveal the damage beneath. The iron teeth of the trap had torn deep into the calf muscle. They'd missed the bone, but the flesh was shredded, torn in ragged lines that wept blood in thick, sluggish streams. The bleeding had slowed during his journey back, the cold acting as a crude tourniquet, but it was still serious. Without proper treatment, infection would set in. And in the isolated mountains, infection meant death. She poured whiskey over the wound. Samuel roared. It was a sound of pure agony that shook the rafters of the cabin, a primal expression of pain that no amount of stoicism could suppress. His head banged back against the floorboards with a sickening thud, and then his eyes rolled back and he passed out. Silence rushed back into the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Abigail's harsh breathing. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She threaded a needle with heavy thread that she'd soaked in alcohol, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. She'd never sutured human flesh before, only practiced on scraps of leather and fabric under her mother's watchful eye. But Samuel didn't have the luxury of her inexperience. He needed this, or he would lose the leg. Or worse. She took a deep breath and began to stitch. For over an hour she worked. She cleaned the wound, picking out bits of debris and dead tissue. She stitched the torn muscle back together with careful precision, her stitches small and tight, the way her mother had taught her. The needle pierced skin and flesh with a soft, sickening resistance that made her stomach turn, but she didn't look away. She couldn't afford to look away. When she was done, she bandaged the leg with strips torn from a clean sheet, wrapping it firmly to keep the stitches in place and prevent further bleeding. Then she built up the fire to a roaring blaze, feeding it log after log until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, fighting against the shock that was trying to shut Samuel's body down. She couldn't lift him to the cot, so she brought the blankets to him, piling them on top of his shivering body until he was cocooned in wool and fur. Then she sat beside him, a cool rag in her hand, wiping the sweat from his forehead as fever began to take hold. She sat there all night, keeping vigil while the storm raged outside and the fire burned low and then high again as she fed it. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time Samuel's breathing changed, every time he stirred or moaned, she was there, checking the bandages, feeling his forehead for signs the fever was getting worse. Around 3 in the morning, Samuel began to mutter. At first it was just fragments, disconnected words that made no sense. But then the delirium took hold fully, and he began to speak in longer sentences lost in a past that Abigail could only glimpse through his fever-broken words. "Don't do it, Warren." Samuel whispered, his hand gripping Abigail's wrist with bruising force, though he didn't seem to know it was her. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something only he could see. "Don't go into that cornfield. They're waiting. The Confederates, they're waiting in the corn." Abigail didn't pull away. She covered his hand with her own, stroking his knuckles gently, trying to anchor him to the present. "I can't hear them," Samuel mumbled, his voice breaking with anguish. "Warren, why can't you hear them?" "It's too quiet. Why is it so quiet?" The words painted a picture Abigail could see clearly. A battlefield. A brother who couldn't hear the warnings. A tragedy that Samuel had carried with him for nearly 20 years, buried under silence and solitude in these mountains. Abigail leaned down, placing her hand on Samuel's burning cheek. She needed to pull him back, needed to bring him home from whatever hell he was reliving. "I'm here," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly, the first time she had chosen to break her silence, not out of panic or emergency, but out of deliberate care. Samuel's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, but they found her face. "I'm here," Abigail said again, her voice raspy from disuse but stronger this time. "You're safe, Samuel. I've got you." Samuel looked at her with a mixture of confusion and wonder, his fever-addled brain struggling to make sense of what he was hearing. "You spoke," he breathed. "Sleep," Abigail commanded softly, her hand cool against his hot skin. "Just sleep. I won't leave you." Samuel's eyes closed, his breathing deepening as the fever broke slightly, giving him a few hours of reprieve. "Knew you could," he muttered, before drifting off into unconsciousness. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of nursing and worry. Abigail changed his bandages regularly, forced broth down his throat when he was conscious enough to swallow, and kept the fire going constantly. The dynamic of the cabin had irrevocably flipped. He was the invalid. She was the protector. On the 3rd day, Samuel was sitting up, propped against the leg of the table. He looked pale and weaker than Abigail had ever seen him, but his mind was clear, his eyes sharp and assessing once more. Abigail was at the counter chopping carrots for a stew. The silence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't a wall between them. It was more like a bridge, something they could choose to cross or not as they wished. "Who taught you to stitch like that?" Samuel asked. His voice was still weak, but there was genuine curiosity in it and something else. Respect. Abigail turned slowly. She didn't use hand signs or gestures. She didn't look at the floor or away. She looked him directly in the eye. "My mother," she said. Her voice was soft, slightly hoarse from years of disuse, but it was steady, real, hers. She was a seamstress before she got sick. She said every woman should know how to mend things, cloth or flesh. You never know when you might need to save a life. Samuel let out a long breath and a smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less like a mountain, and more like a man. "Well, it's a fine voice, Abigail Hayes," he said quietly. "A damn fine voice, worth waiting for." Abigail felt heat creep up her neck and into her cheeks. She looked down at the carrots, a small smile playing on her own lips. "You talk too much," she said, and there was a hint of playfulness in her tone that surprised them both. Samuel laughed, though it turned into a cough that made him wince and grab his injured leg. "I suppose I do." The moment was warm, almost domestic, the kind of easy comfort that comes from shared survival and growing trust. But it was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the high mountains. A gunshot. It echoed off the canyon walls, distant but unmistakable. Then another. Sharp cracks that spoke of rifles, not the random firing of hunters, but something more deliberate, more dangerous. Samuel's face hardened instantly. The softness vanished, replaced by the watchful intensity of a predator that has suddenly realized it's being hunted. He reached for his Colt Navy, checking the cylinder with practiced efficiency despite the pain in his leg. "That's a Winchester rifle," he said, his voice dropping to pure business. "Poachers don't use repeaters, and they don't fire warning shots." Abigail moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. Down in the valley, about a mile away, she saw 3 black specks against the white snow. Riders. They were moving slowly, deliberately, tracking something. Tracking them. "Is it them?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Is it my father? Did he send someone?" Samuel dragged himself up to a sitting position, his face pale with the effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he ignored it. "Your father doesn't have the spine to come up here himself, and he doesn't have the money to hire men who do." He looked at Abigail, his expression dark with understanding. "Did you take anything when you left the saloon? Anything at all?" Abigail shook her head quickly. "Just the clothes I was wearing." "Think," Samuel commanded, and there was an edge to his voice now. "Clayton Garrett is a businessman. He doesn't chase a $50 debt into a blizzard, doesn't risk his men's lives for pocket change. He's chasing something worth more than gold." Abigail's hand went to her pocket automatically, and her fingers closed around something heavy, something she'd been carrying for weeks without really thinking about it, so accustomed to its weight that she'd forgotten it was there. She pulled it out, a heavy silver pocket watch on a tarnished chain. "What is that?" Samuel asked sharply. "I found it in my father's coat," Abigail said, staring at the watch as if seeing it for the first time. "2 weeks before the poker game. He was passed out drunk, and I was looking for money to buy bread. I found this hidden in his inside pocket." She clicked the watch open, expecting to see a clock face. Instead, there was no mechanism at all, just a folded piece of paper yellowed with age, covered in dense handwriting. Numbers and coordinates, mathematical notations, a hand-drawn map with landmarks labeled in careful script. Samuel took the watch from her, his movements careful despite the urgency. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the numbers with the rapid assessment of someone who knew what he was looking at. His face went pale. "This isn't a debt," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is a map." "A map to what?" Abigail asked, though part of her already knew the answer, already understood why her father had guarded this watch like his most precious possession, why Clayton Garrett would brave a Wyoming winter to retrieve it. "A map to the Union Army payroll shipment that went missing in the spring of '65, Samuel said, looking up at her with eyes that reflected the gravity of their situation. 50,000 in gold coins, disappeared during transport through this territory. Men have been searching for it for 17 years. He looked back at the 3 riders moving up the slope closer, now their horses dark against the snow. "Garrett doesn't want his money back, Abigail," Samuel said, cocking the hammer of his revolver with a decisive click. "He thinks you stole the location of a fortune, and he's not coming to take you back." Samuel's eyes met hers, and there was a terrible certainty in them. "They're coming to bury us both." The silence that followed Samuel's declaration was heavier than the snow burying the cabin. The map lay on the table between them like a venomous snake, crinkled and yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The numbers seemed to pulse in the lamplight coordinates that pointed to death and gold in equal measure. Samuel didn't waste time with comforting words or false reassurance. The shift in him was immediate and complete. The gentle giant who read Odyssey by firelight vanished, replaced by the sheriff he'd been 2 decades ago. Despite the agony in his leg, he dragged himself across the floor, blowing out the kerosene lamp with a quick breath. The cabin plunged into gray twilight, lit only by the dying embers in the hearth and the winter sun bleeding weakly through cracks in the shutters. "Listen to me, and listen good," Samuel whispered, his voice grinding like granite on granite. "Garrett brought 3 men. That means he's serious, but it also means he's arrogant. He thinks I'm just a trapper who got lucky once. He thinks you're a helpless mute who can't fight back. That's our edge, the only edge we've got." He handed Abigail the Winchester 1873 rifle that had been hanging on pegs above the door. The cold metal bit into her palms, heavy with the weight of death it could deliver. "Do you know how to use this?" Samuel asked. Abigail shook her head, her hands trembling. "You're going to learn right now." For the next 10 minutes the cabin was filled with the metallic sounds of instruction. Click-clack went the lever action as Samuel walked her through the mechanics. Loading the brass cartridges into the side gate, working the lever to chamber a round, easing the hammer down to safe. His hands guided hers, patient but urgent, teaching a lifetime of knowledge in moments. "It kicks like a Missouri mule," he warned. "Tuck it tight into your shoulder right here. Don't close your eyes when you pull the trigger. You close your eyes, you miss. You miss, we die. Understand?" Abigail nodded, her jaw set with determination. The weight of the gun felt alien in her hands, this instrument of death in the hands that had only ever mended and healed. But looking at Samuel's pale, sweat-sheened face, seeing the blood seeping through his bandages, she realized with cold clarity that he couldn't fight this battle alone. His leg was swollen infection fighting the whiskey she'd poured into the wound. He was the strategist now. She had to be the soldier. They barricaded the door with the heavy oak table, shoving it against the frame with a screech of wood on wood. Abigail dragged the sacks of flour and dried beans to the windows, creating firing positions, stacking them to provide cover while still leaving gaps to shoot through. An hour passed. The wind howled, masking any sound of approach. The waiting was agony. Every creak of timber settling in the cold sounded like a boot step. Every shifting shadow looked like a gunman. Then a voice cut through the wind, smooth and loud and terrifyingly familiar. "Samuel Thornton." Clayton Garrett was shouting from the tree line hidden behind the thick trunks of pines about 50 yards out. His voice carried clearly across the snow. "I know you're in there, Bear, and I know you've got the girl. I don't have a quarrel with you, Mountain Man. This is business, nothing personal. Send the girl out with her father's pocket watch, and you can go back to skinning beavers. I'll even leave you a horse for your trouble." Samuel signaled for Abigail to stay low near the back window. He positioned himself near a gap in the front logs, his Colt Navy revolver resting on a bag of beans aimed at the tree line. "The girl stays," Samuel roared back, his voice thunderous, betraying none of the weakness in his body. "And the watch stays. You want them, you come and get them." Garrett's laugh was dry, humorless, carried on the wind like dead leaves. "Don't be a fool, Thornton. She's damaged goods. Her own daddy sold her for a hand of poker. You really going to die for a mute who's too stupid to speak?" Abigail flinched. The words stung reopening wounds that had never fully healed. She looked at Samuel, expecting to see doubt, expecting him to reconsider the value of defending someone as worthless as her father had always claimed she was. But Samuel didn't look back at her. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, his jaw set in a line of pure fury. "She speaks when she has something worth saying," Samuel shouted, his voice carrying across the snow with absolute conviction. "Which is more than I can say for you, Garrett." Silence from the trees. Then a single crack that split the air. A bullet slammed into the log wall inches from Samuel's head, sending splinters flying. One caught his cheek, drawing a line of blood, but he didn't flinch. "Get down," he hissed. The siege had begun. Bullets began to rain on the cabin like a hailstorm made of lead and death. They weren't shooting to kill yet. They were suppressing fire, keeping Samuel and Abigail pinned down while they maneuvered into better positions. The wood of the cabin splintered and groaned under the impact of high-caliber rounds. One bullet punched through a weak spot in the chinking, exploding through the gap and smashing a jar of dried herbs on the shelf. Glass and sage scattered across the floor. "They're moving," Samuel said, tracking movement through the crack in the logs. "Two on the left flank trying to get around to the side. Garrett staying center, directing them. They want to crossfire us, catch us in a kill zone." He turned to Abigail, and she was huddled under the back window, clutching the rifle like a lifeline. Her eyes were wide, filled with the terror of a prey animal that knows it's been cornered. "Abigail," Samuel barked. It wasn't a whisper or a request. It was a command that cut through her fear like a blade through fog. "The back window. If they get behind the woodshed, they can burn us out. You have to stop them." "I can't," Abigail screamed the first time she'd raised her voice in terror and desperation. "I can't kill a man." Samuel dragged himself toward her, ignoring the blood seeping fresh through his bandages, leaving a smear across the floor. He grabbed her shoulder, his grip firm but not painful. "You aren't killing a man," he said, his eyes burning into hers with an intensity that demanded she listen, that demanded she understand. "You're stopping a monster from walking through that door. Look at me." His hand tightened on her shoulder. "If they get in here, Abigail, you know what they'll do to you. To me. You've seen men like Garrett before. You know what they're capable of." He paused, letting that truth settle between them. "You saved me on the cliff when I was about to fall. Save me now." Abigail swallowed a sob that wanted to tear out of her throat. She nodded, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She turned to the window, peering through the small gap between the shutters with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She saw movement. A man in a long duster was sprinting from tree to tree, closing the distance to the woodshed that sat 20 yards behind the cabin. He was carrying a bundle of rags and a bottle that caught the light. Kerosene. He was going to burn them alive, smoke them out like rabbits from a burrow. Abigail lifted the rifle. It was so heavy. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it would crack bone. She could barely breathe, could barely think past the roaring in her ears. She remembered Samuel's voice through the fog of panic. "Tuck it tight. Don't close your eyes." She aligned the iron sights, the crude V-notch and front post that were supposed to point at death. The man stopped to crouch behind a stump, preparing to light the rag stuffed into the bottle. She held her breath, trying to stop the rifle from shaking, trying to aim at something human, trying to cross a line she'd never imagined crossing. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, slamming into her shoulder with bruising force. The noise was deafening in the small space, a thunderclap that left her ears ringing. The bullet missed the man, but struck the stump inches from his face, exploding the frozen bark in a shower of splinters. The man yelled, falling backward into the snow, dropping the bottle. It shattered on a rock, spilling kerosene harmlessly into the white. He scrambled back on his hands and knees, terrified by the sudden resistance, and retreated to the tree line in a panicked crawl. "I missed," Abigail gasped, cycling the lever with shaking hands, the spent brass cartridge ejecting with a metallic ping. "You turned him back." Samuel grunted, firing 2 shots from his revolver toward the front, keeping the other attackers honest. "That's as good as a kill right now. Good girl. Keep watching that window." The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sun was setting now, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted as night approached, the cold becoming a fifth enemy, invisible but just as deadly as bullets. "Why did they stop?" Abigail whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're regrouping," Samuel said, reloading his cylinder with agonizing slowness. His hands were shaking now, whether from pain or fever she couldn't tell. "They realized we aren't easy pickings. They'll wait for dark. Garrett's a coward, but he's patient. He'll wait until we're cold and tired, until our guard drops." They sat in the growing darkness, listening to the wind and the settling of the cabin around them. Abigail moved to Samuel, checking his leg in the dim light from the shuttered windows. The bleeding had started again, seeping through the bandages. His skin was burning hot to the touch. "If I pass out," Samuel murmured, his voice beginning to slur with exhaustion and pain, "you take the revolver, you hold that door, you understand me?" "You won't pass out," Abigail said firmly, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his leg tighter, trying to staunch the flow. "You promised to read me the end of the book, remember? You don't break promises." Samuel chuckled weakly, the sound wet and pained. "I did, didn't I?" Outside, the wind died down. The silence that replaced it was filled with malice and waiting. Abigail sat with her back against the logs, the rifle across her lap, watching the windows as darkness claimed the world beyond. She wasn't the ghost anymore, invisible and voiceless. She was the guard, the last line of defense between life and death. And as the moon rose, casting silver light over the killing ground outside, she realized with absolute clarity that for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for someone to save her. She was the one doing the saving. Midnight brought the fire, but it didn't start with a rush or a roar. It started with a soft thump on the roof, followed by another. Dust drifted down from the rafters, catching in the faint light from the banked fire. Abigail looked up, her heart already knowing what her mind didn't want to accept. Samuel, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness, snapped awake. He sniffed the air like an animal scenting danger. "Pitch!" He rasped, his voice thick with pain. "Burning pitch!" Another thump, then a crackling sound like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. An orange glow began to flicker through the cracks in the roof boards, growing brighter with each passing second. "They're throwing torches onto the shingles," Samuel said, struggling to sit up, his face twisted with agony and fury. "They aren't coming in. They're smoking us out like we're nothing more than vermin in a hole." Smoke began to curl down from the ceiling in thick, acrid streams. It wasn't the pleasant smell of the hearth fire. This was the choking stench of burning tar and pine pitch chemical, and harsh, filling the cabin with poison. "We have to leave," Abigail said, coughing as the smoke invaded her lungs. She grabbed Samuel's arm, trying to pull him toward the back door. "We have to get to the barn. Thunder's there. If we can get on the horse—" "I can't ride Abigail," Samuel said, his voice grim with the acceptance of a man who knows his limits. "Not with this leg. I'll only slow you down, make you an easy target." He pushed the Colt Navy toward her. "You take the horse. Ride south, don't stop until you reach Fort Laramie. I'll cover you from the door, buy you time." Abigail stopped. She looked at the man who had bought her not to own her, but to free her. The man who had listened when the whole world had taught her that her voice didn't matter. The man who had seen past her silence to the person trapped inside. "No," she said. It was a single word, but it was hard as iron, unyielding as the mountains themselves. She grabbed his arm and hauled him up with a strength born of desperation. He groaned, putting weight on his ruined leg, his face going white with the shock of pain. But Abigail wedged her shoulder under his armpit, taking as much of his weight as her small frame could bear. "We go together," she hissed through gritted teeth. "Or we burn together. Now move." Samuel looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the frightened girl who'd stood behind her father's chair in that saloon, but a woman who had found her strength in the crucible of survival. "Together," he agreed, and despite everything there was pride in his voice. The roof was roaring now, fully engulfed. Heat radiated down, blistering their skin, making the air shimmer and warp. The cabin was filling with black smoke that stung their eyes and seared their lungs with every breath. "The back door." Samuel coughed, leaning heavily on Abigail. "It's closer to the barn. On 3. They stumbled to the back door. Abigail could hear the fire eating the wood above them, could hear the timbers beginning to groan and crack. 1, Samuel counted. Abigail unbarred the door with one hand, the other wrapped around Samuel's waist. 2. She could feel the heat building behind them, the fire feeding on oxygen growing stronger. 3. Abigail kicked the door open with all her strength. Cold air rushed in, and the fire above them roared in response, a whoosh of flame that turned the cabin into an oven. They stumbled out into the snow, into the blinding darkness and bitter cold. "There! By the door!" a voice shouted. A gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past Abigail's ear so close she felt the displacement of air, heard it snap a twig on a nearby bush. "Run!" Samuel roared, trying to push her forward, trying to make his broken body move faster. They scrambled toward the barn 30 yards away that might as well have been 30 miles. The snow was knee-deep in places, each step a battle. Samuel was dragging his leg, grunting with every agonized movement, leaving a trail of blood dark against white. Another shot rang out. This one found its mark. Samuel jerked as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. He didn't scream. He just grunted a wet, heavy sound and pitched forward into the snow. "Samuel!" Abigail screamed his name, all pretense abandoned, all silence shattered. She dropped to her knees beside him, the rifle falling forgotten into the snow. "No, no, no. Go!" Samuel gasped, clutching his shoulder. Blood was dark against the white snow, spreading in a growing stain. "I'm done, Abigail. Get to the horse. Ride. Don't look back." From the darkness, figures were emerging. 3 of them walking slowly now, confident in their victory. The cabin behind them was a towering inferno, casting hellish orange light across the scene, turning the snow into fields of fire. Abigail looked at the approaching men's silhouettes backlit by flame. She looked at the barn 10 yards away, so close she could hear Thunder inside, kicking at his stall, smelling smoke and sensing fear. She looked at Samuel, bleeding in the snow, shot twice his life, leaking away into the frozen ground. She didn't run. Instead, she grabbed Samuel's coat collar with both hands and pulled. She screamed with the effort, her boots slipping on ice, her muscles burning her back, feeling like it would break. But she dragged him. Foot by foot, inch by inch, fueled by something beyond strength, beyond reason. "Get up," she shrieked, her voice raw and primal. "You don't die here. Not like this. Get up." Samuel, spurred by her will, by the sheer force of her refusal to let him go, pushed himself to his hands and knees. He crawled. She pulled. Together they moved like one wounded creature, desperate and determined. They tumbled through the barn door just as a bullet splintered the doorframe, sending wood chips flying. Abigail slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the wooden latch, barring it from the inside. They were trapped, but they were alive. For now. Inside, Thunder was in a panic, eyes rolling white, kicking at his stall. The horse could smell smoke, could sense death approaching, and every instinct was screaming to run. Samuel slumped against a hay bale, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was fading fast. Blood loss from 2 wounds, now his face the color of old parchment. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The floorboards. Under the tack box." Abigail scrambled to the heavy wooden box in the corner where Samuel kept the saddles and bridles. She shoved it aside with strength she didn't know she still possessed. Beneath it was a loose floorboard. She pried it up with her fingers, nails breaking splinters driving into her palms. "What is it?" she asked, already reaching into the dark space below. "Dynamite," Samuel whispered. "From the old silver mine. 3 sticks. I kept them, just in case." Abigail pulled out 3 red sticks wrapped in oil paper, the fuses trailing like tails. She stared at them. These instruments of controlled destruction and understanding began to dawn cold and clear. Outside, Clayton's voice drifted through the cracks in the barn walls, close now, right outside the door. "Nowhere left to run, little bird," he taunted, his voice thick with victory. "The cabin's gone. The barn's next. Come out now, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to tell me where that gold is. Make it easy on yourself." Abigail looked at Samuel. He was holding his Colt Navy, but his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't have hit a target 3 feet away. He looked at her with eyes full of apology, full of regret for bringing her to this end. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I wanted to give you a life. I only gave you a grave." Abigail picked up the dynamite. She looked at the fuse, short and ready. She looked at the lucifer matches sitting on a shelf near the door. Then she looked at the back wall of the barn, the wood old and rotted near the bottom, weakened by years of moisture and neglect. Behind that wall was the steep slope of the mountain, covered in a thick blanket of unstable snow. Snow that had been piling up all winter, layer upon layer, waiting for the right trigger to send it cascading down in unstoppable fury. She remembered the map, the coordinates, the promise of gold that had brought death to this mountain. But more than that, she remembered the sound she'd heard 2 weeks ago, distant and rumbling. An avalanche somewhere in the high peaks, the mountain claiming its own. She crawled over to Samuel, moving carefully in the confined space. She took the gun from his shaking hand, but she didn't aim it at the door. She looked into his eyes, and she saw fear there, fear not for himself, but for her, for what would happen when Clayton broke through. "You didn't give me a grave, Samuel," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You gave me a voice. You gave me choice. You gave me myself back." She leaned down and kissed his forehead. It was a goodbye and a promise, a benediction and an oath all at once. "Cover your head," she commanded. Abigail stood up on shaking legs. She struck a match against the rough wood of the stall, the flame flaring bright in the darkness. She touched it to the short fuse of the dynamite, watching it spark and hiss to life. "Garrett!" she screamed, her voice piercing the night, louder than the fire, louder than her fear. "I'm here." Clayton laughed outside, the sound of a predator that thinks its prey has finally given up. "That's more like it," he called back, moving toward the barn door. "Now we're being reasonable." "This isn't your gold, Garrett," Abigail yelled, her voice carrying across the burning clearing, echoing off the canyon walls. "It never was." She didn't throw the dynamite at the door where the men were gathered. She didn't try to kill them directly. Instead, she turned to the back wall of the barn, to the weakened boards directly beneath the towering snowpack of the cliff above. "It belongs to the mountain," Abigail whispered. And she threw the dynamite at the base of the structural beams, right where the barn met the slope, directly under the millions of tons of snow that had been waiting all winter for a reason to fall. She dove onto Samuel, covering his massive body with her own small frame, burying her face in the buffalo fur of his coat, wrapping her arms around his head. The explosion wasn't a noise. It was a physical force that shattered reality itself. The back of the barn disintegrated in a blast of splinters and fire and concussive force that traveled through the ground, through the air, through everything. But the explosion was only the trigger. High above them, the snowpack felt the shockwave. It shuddered, it cracked, and then with a roar that drowned out every other sound in creation, it began to move. The white death came down the mountain like the wrath of God made manifest. Clayton Garrett, standing outside the barn door, looked up at the sound. His confident smile vanished, replaced by pure primal terror. He turned to run his men, scattering like leaves in a storm. But you cannot outrun an avalanche. You cannot outrun the mountain when it decides to move. The wall of snow hit the barn with the force of 1,000 freight trains. The world ended in white. The roar was so loud it ceased to be sound and became a vibration that rattled the very marrow of bones. Timber exploded, stone shattered, everything solid became fluid, everything permanent became temporary. And then, as quickly as the fury had been unleashed, it stopped. Darkness. Absolute crushing darkness. Silence so complete it felt like being deaf, like the whole world had been swallowed by the mountain and would never speak again. Abigail coughed, the air thick with dust and the smell of pulverized pine. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still breathing. She lay pinned beneath the heavy buffalo coat, Samuel's massive arm thrown over her like a steel bar. The barn had collapsed, but the heavy oak beams of the hayloft had fallen in a triangle against the stone wall, creating a pocket of air no larger than the inside of a stagecoach. They were buried under 20 feet of snow and timber. But they were alive. "Samuel," Abigail whispered into the darkness. The silence was terrifying, more frightening than the avalanche had been. "Here," came the response, so weak she almost didn't hear it. "Legs, broken again. Can't feel my arm." But he was alive. They were both alive, buried in the mountain's embrace, but breathing. For 2 days they lay in that frozen tomb. They survived on the warmth of their bodies, pressed together, and the handfuls of snow Abigail could reach through a gap in the debris, melting it in her mouth before letting Samuel drink from her cupped hands. In the absolute darkness, there were no secrets left between them. Samuel, delirious with fever and pain, told her about the war. About his brother Warren, who couldn't hear the Confederate soldiers calling his name before they shot him down in a cornfield outside Gettysburg. About the guilt that had driven Samuel into these mountains seeking isolation because he couldn't save the one person he'd loved most. Abigail told him about her mother's songs, the lullabies Catherine had sung while sewing by candlelight. She sang them softly into the darkness, her voice rusty and uncertain at first, then growing stronger. The melodies filled the tiny space, keeping Samuel tethered to the living world when fever tried to drag him down into permanent silence. On the third morning, a shaft of light pierced their tomb. Thunder, who had miraculously survived in his stall on the far side of the collapse, had been kicking at the debris. His desperate struggles had loosened the snowpack above, and a beam of pure sunlight, blinding after so long in darkness, cut through the gloom. It took Abigail 4 hours to dig a tunnel wide enough for them to crawl through. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her fingernails torn and broken, but she didn't stop. She clawed at snow and wood with the desperate strength of someone who had come too far to give up now. When they finally emerged, gasping into the blinding brightness of the Wyoming winter, the landscape had completely changed. The valley was gone, filled level with white. The burning remains of the cabin were buried under 30 feet of snow. Of Clayton Garrett and his men there was no sign. The mountain had claimed its debt and swallowed the evidence whole. Abigail and Samuel clung to each other in the snow, two broken people who had somehow become whole through shared survival. Around them, the world was silent and clean, washed white by the mountain's judgment. They had won. But the price had been everything Samuel had built in his years of solitude and nearly their lives. As Abigail helped Samuel stand supporting his weight as they began the long, agonizing journey down the mountain, she realized that the silence she'd worn for 6 years was truly gone. In its place was something better, a voice that could sing, could scream, could whisper comfort in the dark. They limped down the mountain together, Abigail supporting the giant who had once carried her. It would take them a week to reach the settlement of Fort Laramie, but they had survived the unsurvivable. And in the warmth of that shared victory, they had found something neither had expected. They had found each other. The descent from Laramie Peak was a journey through purgatory, 7 days of agony that tested the limits of human endurance and will. Abigail supported Samuel's massive frame as they made their way down trails that seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each step a negotiation with pain and exhaustion. Samuel was fading. The 2 bullet wounds, the broken leg that had been rebroken in the avalanche, the infection that burned through his veins like wildfire, all of it was slowly killing him. His skin had taken on a gray pallor, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that frightened Abigail more than the avalanche had. But she refused to let him go. At night, when they made camp in whatever shelter they could find, a grove of trees or an overhang of rock, Abigail would build small fires and share what little warmth they had. She hunted rabbits with the skills Samuel had taught her during their brief time together, using the Winchester with trembling hands until she learned to steady them, to breathe through the kick of the rifle to provide. During the long, cold nights when Samuel drifted in and out of fever dreams, Abigail would talk to him. She told him stories about her mother, about the little house in Cheyenne before the typhoid came, about the songs Catherine had sung, and the way she'd smelled like lavender and bread dough. She talked until her voice was hoarse, keeping him anchored to the world of the living with the sound of her words. On the 4th night, huddled beneath a shared blanket near a fire that struggled against the wind, Samuel spoke clearly for the first time in days. "Why did I buy you?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel but lucid. "You asked me once on the mountain. You want to know the real answer." Abigail looked at him across the flickering flames. "Yes." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. "My brother Warren. He was isolated by his deafness. After the cannon fire took his hearing, people stopped talking to him. They'd speak louder as if volume could penetrate the silence, or they'd just ignore him altogether, talk around him like he wasn't there." He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "I learned to listen differently because of Warren. Learned to watch eyes and hands and the way a body moves. Learned that communication isn't just words, it's everything we do." Samuel looked at Abigail, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "When I saw you in that saloon standing behind your father with your eyes on the floor, I saw a different kind of isolation. Not deafness, but a silence that was chosen because speaking brought pain. I saw Warren all over again, someone cut off from the world, and I thought maybe I could do for you what I failed to do for him." "What did you fail to do?" Abigail asked softly. "I couldn't save him," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "Couldn't make him hear the danger. He walked into that cornfield at Gettysburg, and Confederate sharpshooters were waiting. I shouted until my throat bled, but he couldn't hear me. And when they shot him, I could only watch him fall." Tears tracked down Samuel's weathered face, freezing in his beard. "I wanted to give you what I couldn't give Warren, a choice, a voice, a chance to be heard." Abigail moved around the fire and sat beside him, taking his calloused hand in hers. "You did give me that. You listened when no one else bothered to. You saw me when I'd made myself invisible." She squeezed his hand gently. "And now I'm choosing to save you the way you saved me." Samuel smiled, a tired but genuine expression that transformed his face. He squeezed her hand back, and they sat together in the firelight, two souls who had found each other in the loneliest place on earth. On the 7th day, they stumbled into Fort Laramie. The settlement was a rough collection of buildings clustered around a military outpost, a place where civilization clung to existence by its fingernails. People stopped what they were doing to stare as Abigail and Samuel appeared on the main road, a strange sight that defied easy explanation. The giant Bear Thornton, known throughout the territory for his solitary strength, was barely able to stand. He leaned heavily on a slip of a girl who couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet, yet somehow she was holding him upright through sheer determination. "Get the doctor!" someone shouted, and people began to rush toward them. Dr. Ernesto Martinez was a Mexican physician who'd fled north during the French intervention, bringing with him skills learned in battlefield hospitals and frontier medicine posts. He took one look at Samuel and immediately commandeered 2 men to help carry him to the clinic. "How long has he been like this?" Martinez asked Abigail as they laid Samuel on an examination table. "A week," Abigail said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "He was shot twice. Shoulder and leg. The leg was already injured before a bear trap. Then it broke again in—" she hesitated, "in an accident." Martinez cut away Samuel's makeshift bandages and let out a low whistle. "These wounds should have killed him. The infection alone. And you say he's been walking for a week." "I was helping him," Abigail said quietly. The doctor looked at her with new respect. "You did more than help, young lady. You kept him alive. Another day and—" He shook his head, not finishing the thought. For the next 3 hours, Martinez worked on Samuel. He extracted the bullet from his shoulder, cleaned and resutured both gunshot wounds, and set the broken leg, properly splinting it with sturdy boards and tight bandages. He administered laudanum for the pain and quinine for the fever, precious medicines he kept locked away for the most serious cases. When he finally emerged from the back room, wiping blood from his hands, Abigail jumped to her feet from where she'd been sitting in the waiting area. "He'll live," Martinez said, and Abigail felt her knees go weak with relief. "But it was closer than I'd like. The infection was deep, very deep. He'll need weeks of rest, and that leg—" The doctor shook his head. "He'll walk again, but there will always be a limp. The bone didn't set right the first time, and breaking it again made it worse." "But he'll live," Abigail repeated, needing to hear it again. "He'll live," Martinez confirmed. "Thanks to you. Whatever you did up there, however you kept him going, it made the difference." Abigail was allowed to see Samuel that evening. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that was the most beautiful thing she'd ever witnessed. She sat beside his bed and took his hand, holding it gently so as not to disturb the bandages that wrapped his shoulder. "You're going to be all right," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "We both are." Over the next week, as Samuel slowly regained his strength, Fort Laramie buzzed with rumors and speculation. The story of Clayton Garrett and his men going missing near Laramie Peak had reached the settlement days before Samuel and Abigail's arrival. Search parties had been organized, but turned back when they encountered the massive avalanche that had reshaped the entire valley. Sheriff Horace Quinn, an older man with white hair and sharp eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's cruelty, came to visit Samuel on the 3rd day of his recovery. "Heard you had some trouble up on the peak, Thornton," Quinn said, settling into a chair beside the bed with the groan of a man whose joints ached with age and old injuries. Samuel propped up against pillows, looked at the sheriff with a neutral expression. "Had some weather trouble. Avalanche took out my cabin." "Avalanche took out more than your cabin," Quinn said. "Clayton Garrett and 2 of his men haven't been seen since they rode up that mountain. You know anything about that?" "Know that Garrett was tracking me," Samuel said carefully. "Don't know why. Before I could ask him about it, the mountain decided to rearrange itself." Quinn studied Samuel's face for a long moment, then looked at Abigail, who was sitting in the corner mending one of Samuel's shirts. "And you, Miss Hayes, you have anything to add?" Abigail looked up, meeting the sheriff's eyes without flinching. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "Mr. Garrett wanted something he thought I had. When he couldn't get it peacefully, he tried to burn us out. The mountain took exception to men trying to burn down one of its cabins." There was a ghost of a smile on Quinn's weathered face. "The mountain took exception. I like that." He stood his knees cracking like pistol shots. "Well, I suppose that's the end of it then. Can't question a man who's buried under 30 feet of snow and ice." He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "My sister Margaret, she went deaf from scarlet fever when she was 12. People stopped talking to her after that, stopped seeing her as a person. She died alone and sad at 35, never having found anyone who'd take the time to understand her." Quinn looked at Samuel, then at Abigail. "What I'm saying is, I see what you did here, Thornton, and I think it's good, real good." After the sheriff left, Abigail moved to Samuel's bedside. "He knows," she said quietly. "He knows," Samuel agreed. "But he's a good man. He won't push it." "What about the map?" Abigail asked. "The gold." Samuel shook his head slowly. "The map burned in the cabin. Even if it didn't, that gold is buried under the avalanche now, mixed in with timber and stone and enough snow to fill a dozen railway cars. It would take an army to dig it out, and by the time anyone could get up there, spring runoff will have moved everything around. The mountain kept it." Abigail reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver watch, the one that had started this whole deadly chase. She'd grabbed it from the cabin before they fled, not for the map, but because it had belonged to her father, and despite everything, some small part of her wanted to remember where she'd come from. She opened it, confirming what she already knew. The map was gone, lost to fire or snow or both. All that remained was an empty case, tarnished silver, that reflected nothing but shadows. "What should I do with it?" she asked. Samuel looked at the watch, then at her. "Whatever you want. It's yours." Abigail walked to the window of the clinic and opened it, letting in a blast of cold air. Without ceremony, she tossed the watch out into the muddy street. It landed in a puddle with a small splash and lay there forgotten and worthless. "I don't want it," she said, closing the window. "I don't want anything from that life." Samuel smiled. "Then we start a new one." One afternoon, while Samuel was sleeping and Abigail was reading in the corner of the clinic, a visitor arrived who made Abigail's heart sink into her stomach. It was a man who looked hauntingly familiar. He had Silas Hayes's build, his coloring, the same weak chin and watery eyes. But this man was younger, perhaps 40, and he wore the collar of a minister. "Miss Hayes?" he asked tentatively. "Abigail Hayes." Abigail stood slowly, her hand moving unconsciously toward the Winchester that leaned against the wall near Samuel's bed. "Who are you?" "Reverend Thomas Hayes," the man said. "I'm your father's brother. Your uncle, though I don't expect you know that. Silas and I haven't spoken in 20 years. Abigail's grip on the rifle relaxed slightly, but she didn't move away from it. "What do you want?" Thomas Hayes looked pained, as if the words he needed to say were physically difficult to speak. "I came to tell you that your father passed away 3 weeks ago. He was found in an alley behind the Iron Horse Saloon. The doctor said his liver finally gave out. Too much whiskey for too many years." Abigail felt nothing. She'd expected to feel something, grief or relief or anger, but there was only a hollow emptiness where emotion should have been. "I see," she said quietly. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I also came to apologize. I knew Silas was a drunk and a gambler. I knew he'd taken you in after Catherine died, and I should have checked on you, should have made sure you were all right. But I was angry at him for the way he'd lived his life, and I let that anger keep me from my duty to family." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "This isn't much, but it's what I can offer. There was a small insurance policy Catherine had taken out years ago before she got sick. The payout finally came through. It's not a fortune, but it's yours by right." Abigail took the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a bank draft for $200, more money than she'd ever seen in her life. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt automatic, empty. Thomas Hayes looked at Samuel's sleeping form, then back at Abigail. "Are you all right? Are you safe here?" For the first time since her uncle had arrived, Abigail felt a genuine emotion. It was a warmth that started in her chest and spread outward, chasing away the cold emptiness. "Yes," she said, and meant it absolutely. "I'm safe. I'm more than safe. I'm home." Thomas smiled relief evident on his face. "Good. That's good." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Your mother was a good woman, Abigail. The best I ever knew. I think she'd be proud of you, of the strength you've shown." After he left, Abigail sat down heavily, staring at the bank draft. $200. Combined with what little money Samuel had saved from his trapping, it would be enough to start over. Enough to build a new cabin, buy supplies, create a life. She looked at Samuel, still sleeping peacefully, and made a decision. The money from her mother's foresight would become the foundation of their future. Catherine Hayes in death would give her daughter the freedom she'd always wanted her to have in life. Spring came to Wyoming in 1883 with an explosion of wildflowers that painted the meadows in impossible colors. Purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf balsam, root red Indian paintbrush, and white phlox. They covered the land like a quilt, stitched by divine hands. High in a different range, the Wind River Mountains, a new cabin stood. It was smaller than Samuel's old fortress, but it was built with the same care and attention to detail. The logs were chinked tight against the wind, the stone chimney drew perfectly, and the roof was pitched steep to shed snow. Samuel sat on the porch, a hickory cane resting against his knee. The limp Martinez had predicted was permanent, a reminder of the mountain's price, but Samuel moved with it as gracefully as a man could. He was whittling a piece of cedar, his knife moving in sure economical strokes, shaping the wood into something useful. The door opened and Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair braided back in a thick plait. She carried a tray with 2 cups of coffee and set it down on the small table between the chairs. She settled onto the porch railing, looking out over the valley spread below them. From here they could see for miles. Mountain peaks touched the sky in every direction, and the valley floor was a patchwork of green meadows and dark stands of pine. "The trader came by today," Samuel said, testing the edge of his knife against his thumb. "Said there's still rumors about that lost Union payroll. People saying the map was lost in an avalanche over near Laramie Peak." Abigail reached into her pocket and pulled out the empty silver watch. She'd kept it, after all, not as a reminder of her father, but as a symbol of what she'd left behind. She tossed it to Samuel, and he caught it with his free hand, chuckling. "Let them look," Abigail said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Let them search until they're old and gray. We have everything we need right here." Samuel smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way that still made Abigail's heart skip. "We do at that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their coffee and watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the valley. It was a peace neither had known before, a quiet that came not from fear or isolation, but from contentment. "Do you miss it?" Abigail asked eventually. "The old cabin? The solitude?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "I miss the books I lost in the fire. Those took years to collect. But the solitude—" He shook his head. "No, I thought I wanted to be alone, thought I deserved it after failing Warren, but turns out I was just hiding." He looked at Abigail, and his expression was open, vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. "You gave me a reason to stop hiding." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. You gave me a reason to stop being silent." The moment stretched between them full of unspoken words and possibilities that neither was quite ready to name yet. But they didn't need to name them. Time would take care of that. Several weeks later, on a warm June morning when the air smelled of pine sap and wildflowers, Abigail made breakfast with a secret sitting heavy in her chest. She moved around the kitchen area of the cabin, frying eggs and bacon, baking biscuits in the Dutch oven that hung over the fire. Samuel came in from feeding Thunder, his limp barely noticeable now that he'd grown accustomed to it. He washed his hands in the basin and sat down at the table, watching Abigail with the observant intensity that never quite went away. "You're quiet this morning," he said. "More than usual." Abigail brought the plates to the table and sat down across from him. She took a breath, gathering her courage, then placed her hand on her stomach in a gesture that was barely perceptible but spoke volumes. Samuel's eyes widened. His gaze went from her face to her hand, to her face again, understanding dawning like sunrise. "Are you—" He couldn't seem to finish the question. Abigail nodded, a smile breaking across her face despite her nervousness. "I think so. I'm almost certain." Samuel stood so fast his chair fell backward with a clatter. He moved around the table and pulled Abigail into his arms, lifting her off her feet despite the doctor's warnings about his leg. He spun her in a circle, laughing with a joy that was almost childlike in its purity. "Put me down, you fool," Abigail said, but she was laughing too, her arms wrapped around his neck. "You'll hurt yourself." Samuel set her down gently, as if she were made of spun glass. His hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "A child," he whispered, awe and wonder mixing in his voice. "Our child." "Our child," Abigail confirmed, and then she was crying, happy tears that she didn't try to hide or wipe away. Samuel kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips each touch a promise and a prayer. "The child will never have to be silent," he said fiercely. "Never have to hide or be afraid or feel worthless." "Never," Abigail agreed, her hands covering his where they rested against her face. "We'll teach them to sing, to speak, to be loud and alive and free." Over the following months, Samuel and Abigail fell into a new rhythm. Samuel built a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving intricate designs into the headboard bears and eagles and mountains. Abigail sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her needle flying with the skill her mother had passed down. They read together in the evenings, taking turns with the few books Samuel had managed to replace from his lost library. Sometimes Abigail would read from Jane Eyre while Samuel whittled. Sometimes he would read from Shakespeare, his deep voice giving life to Romeo and Juliet, to Hamlet, to Othello. And sometimes, when the work was done and the fire burned low, Abigail would sing. She sang the lullabies her mother had taught her, the ones she'd whispered in the dark tomb beneath the avalanche to keep Samuel tethered to life. Her voice grew stronger with each passing week, more confident, until it filled the cabin with warmth, as real as the heat from the hearth. In late September, as the aspen leaves were turning gold and the first hint of winter touched the high peaks, a traveling preacher made his way through the Wind River country. Samuel and Abigail met him on the trail, and by that evening they were married in a simple ceremony conducted on their porch with Thunder as their only witness beyond the preacher himself. Abigail wore her blue dress and a crown of wildflowers that Samuel had woven for her. Samuel wore his best shirt, the one Abigail had mended so many times it was more her stitching than original fabric. They spoke their vows as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. "I promise to listen," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "To hear not just your words but your silence. To see you always." "I promise to speak," Abigail responded, her voice clear and strong. "To never hide in silence again. To be your partner in everything." They sealed their vows with a kiss as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Abigail felt something in her chest that she'd never felt before. Complete and total peace. The sense that she was exactly where she belonged with exactly who she was meant to be with. December came again, bringing with it the anniversary of that terrible night on Laramie Peak. A full year had passed since the avalanche, since Garrett and his men had been claimed by the mountain. Samuel and Abigail didn't speak of it, didn't mark the occasion with words, but they both felt the weight of that night, the ghosts of what might have been if things had gone differently. The cabin was warm despite the cold outside. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the world in fresh white. Inside, a fire roared in the hearth, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. Samuel sat in the rocking chair he'd built, cradling a tiny bundle in his massive arms. Catherine Warren. Thornton, born 2 weeks earlier after a long labor that had terrified Samuel and exhausted Abigail, slept peacefully against his chest. She had Samuel's dark hair and Abigail's delicate features, and when she opened her eyes, they were a blue-gray that reminded Samuel of storm clouds over the prairie. Abigail stood at the counter kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. She hummed as she worked a low, contented sound that spoke of happiness Samuel had never thought he'd witness, let alone be part of. "Listen to that, Catherine," Samuel whispered to his daughter, his voice pitched low so as not to wake her fully. "That's your mama singing. Most beautiful sound in these mountains." The baby made a small noise, a coo of contentment, and Samuel's heart swelled so large he thought it might crack his ribs. Abigail looked over and smiled. "Is she sleeping?" "Like an angel?" Samuel confirmed. He stood carefully mindful of his leg and carried Catherine to the cradle he'd built. He laid her down gently, tucking the blanket around her tiny form, and just watched her breathe for a long moment. Abigail came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. They stood together watching their daughter sleep, and the moment felt sacred, somehow touched by grace. "What are you thinking?" Abigail asked softly. Samuel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I'm thinking about choices, about the path that led us here. If I hadn't gone to that saloon that night, if you hadn't saved me on the cliff, if the avalanche had buried us instead of Garrett, so many moments where things could have gone differently." He turned to look at Abigail, his eyes serious. "And I'm thinking that every choice, every moment of pain and fear and struggle was worth it to get here, to have this, to have you and her and this life we've built." Abigail squeezed his hand. "I was terrified that night in the barn. When I threw that dynamite, I thought we were both going to die. I thought the mountain would take us all." "But you threw it anyway," Samuel said. "You chose to fight." "I chose us," Abigail corrected. "I chose life over silence, voice over invisibility." They moved away from the cradle and sat together by the fire. Samuel pulled Abigail close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. Outside, the wind picked up howling around the corners of the cabin, but inside there was only warmth and light and the quiet breathing of their daughter. "Do you ever wonder about the gold?" Abigail asked. "If we should have tried to find it?" Samuel shook his head. "The gold cost too many people too much. It cost Garrett his life. It nearly cost us ours. Some treasures aren't worth the price." He kissed the top of Abigail's head. "Besides, we have our own treasure now, one that won't tarnish or lose value, one that grows more precious every day." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire dance and listening to the storm outside. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes between people who have survived the unsurvivable together, who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. Eventually, Abigail began to hum again, and then the humming turned into soft singing. The lullaby her mother had taught her, the one she'd sung in the darkness beneath the snow to keep Samuel alive. "Hush now, my darling, the night's drawing near. The stars are your lanterns, you've nothing to fear. The wind may blow cold, and the snow may fall deep, but safe in my arms you will peacefully sleep." Samuel closed his eyes, letting Abigail's voice wash over him. It was the sound of home, of safety, of everything he'd never thought he'd have. And as he sat there with his wife in his arms and his daughter sleeping nearby, Samuel Thornton understood that he had been given not just a second chance, but a complete transformation. He had gone into those mountains to hide from the guilt of failing his brother. He had lived in isolation, punishing himself for a death he couldn't have prevented. But Abigail had changed everything. She had reminded him that listening was the greatest gift you could give someone, that seeing people truly seeing them was an act of love. The months turned into years, and life in the Wind River Mountains settled into a rhythm as natural as the changing seasons. Catherine grew from an infant into a toddler, taking her first steps on the porch of the cabin while Samuel and Abigail watched with hearts full to bursting. Her first word was, "Papa," and Samuel cried shamelessly when he heard it. The trader who came through the mountains twice a year brought news of the outside world. Clayton Garrett had been officially declared dead after 18 months with no sign of him or his men. The search for the lost Union payroll continued sporadically, but most people had given up accepting that if it existed at all, it was lost to the mountains forever. Silas Hayes's debts had been settled by the sale of what little he owned, and the Iron Horse Saloon had new owners who didn't allow gambling. The world was moving on, forgetting the small dramas that had seemed so important at the time. But in the high mountains, in a cabin built with love and determination, Abigail and Samuel created their own world. It was a world where voices mattered, where silence was a choice rather than a prison, where love was measured not in gold, but in quiet moments and shared laughter. On a crisp autumn evening when Catherine was 2 years old and Abigail was pregnant with their second child, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Catherine played at their feet with wooden blocks Samuel had carved for her, stacking them into towers and knocking them down with delighted giggles. "Tell me again," Catherine demanded in the way only toddlers can, imperious and sweet at once. "Tell the mountain story." It had become her favorite tale, though Samuel and Abigail had sanitized it considerably for young ears. In Catherine's version there was a brave man and a clever woman who outsmarted bad men with the help of the mountain itself, which protected them with snow because they were good and kind. Samuel picked up his daughter and settled her on his lap. Well, now it all started on a cold October night in a place called Cheyenne. As Samuel told the story with Catherine hanging on every word, Abigail watched them with a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what her mother had wanted for her. Not wealth or status or an easy life, but love and safety and the freedom to be herself. Later, after Catherine had been put to bed and the cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire, Abigail and Samuel stood on the porch looking up at the stars. They were brilliant here. Away from any town lights a river of silver across the black velvet sky. "Do you think they're up there?" Abigail asked softly. "My mother and your brother." "Watching." Samuel put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against the chill. "I like to think so, and I like to think they're proud of us, of what we built from all that pain." "Warren would like Catherine," Abigail said with certainty. "She's so full of noise and questions and life." "He would love her," Samuel agreed, "and your mother would love seeing you happy, seeing you free." They stood together in the starlight, and Abigail thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the poker table where she'd been sold like property to the cliff where she'd first broken her silence to the barn where she'd chosen to fight rather than flee. Every moment had been necessary. Every choice had led them here. "I have no regrets," Abigail said suddenly. "Even with everything that happened, all the pain and fear and near death, I wouldn't change any of it. Because changing it might mean not ending up here with you with Catherine." Samuel turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I spent 20 years regretting that I couldn't save Warren, 20 years punishing myself for a failure I had no control over. But you taught me something, Abigail. You taught me that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to live fully for them, to take the second chances they didn't get and make something beautiful." He kissed her forehead, tender and reverent. "You gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain instead of disappearing into it. And I will spend every day I have left making sure you never regret that." "I never will," Abigail promised. "Because you gave me something even more precious. You gave me my voice back. You listened when the whole world had taught me that silence was safer than speaking. You saw me when I'd made myself invisible." They went inside as the temperature dropped, the cold of night settling over the mountains. Inside the cabin was warm and bright. Catherine slept peacefully in her small bed in the corner, her breathing soft and even. The fire crackled in the hearth. Books lined the shelves Samuel had built. Abigail's sewing basket sat near the rocking chair full of tiny clothes for the baby that would arrive in the spring. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, built not on gold or ambition, but on something far more valuable: understanding, acceptance, love that had been forged in fire and ice and had emerged stronger than steel. As Abigail and Samuel prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine of banking the fire and checking the door, Abigail found herself humming again. The lullaby her mother had taught her, the one that had saved Samuel's life in the darkness beneath the snow. Samuel paused in his nightly tasks and just listened, his eyes closing, with the simple pleasure of hearing his wife's voice fill their home. It was a sound he never took for granted, knowing as he did the long silence that had preceded it, the years of fear and pain that had stolen her voice away. "Sing it again," he requested softly. "Please." So Abigail sang. She sang as she moved around the cabin, her voice clear and strong and free. She sang the old lullaby, and then other songs her mother had taught her, and new ones. She was creating melodies that spoke of mountains and survival and love that conquered everything. And in that moment, in that small cabin high in the Wind River Mountains, surrounded by the people she loved and the life she'd built from ashes and avalanches, Abigail Hayes Thornton understood a truth that she would carry for the rest of her days. Silence had kept her alive when she was young and afraid and powerless. But speaking, choosing to raise her voice when it mattered most, had given her a life worth living. The mountain had tested them, had taken almost everything, but in the end it had given them to each other. And that was worth more than all the lost gold in the world. Years would pass. Catherine would grow and eventually be joined by two brothers, Thomas and Warren, named for the family that had come before. The cabin would expand as their family grew. Samuel would teach his children to track and hunt and respect the mountains that surrounded them. Abigail would teach them to read and write and speak their minds without fear. And every winter, when the snow fell deep and the wind howled around the corners of their warm home, Abigail would tell her children the story. Not the sanitized version Samuel told when they were young, but the real story. The story of a girl who had learned that silence could protect you, but only speaking could save you. The story of a man who had hidden his pain in the mountains until a voiceless girl taught him that listening was the greatest act of love. The story of an avalanche that had buried evil and left love standing. The story of their family forged in fire and ice and made stronger for having survived both. And the children would listen with wide eyes, and they would understand that the greatest treasures in life weren't found in lost army payrolls or gold rushes or poker games in smoky saloons. The greatest treasures were the people who saw you when you were invisible, who heard you when you were silent, who chose to stay when running would have been easier. The legend of Abigail Hayes and Samuel Thornton would be whispered in Wyoming for generations, though the details would change with each telling. Some said they'd found the lost gold and lived like royalty. Others said they'd died in the avalanche and their ghosts haunted Laramie Peak. A few claimed to have seen them in Fort Laramie years later, old and gray, and still holding hands like newlyweds. But the truth was simpler and more beautiful than any legend. They had simply lived. They had raised their children in a cabin built with love. They had grown old together. Samuel's limp becoming more pronounced with the years, Abigail's voice growing softer but never silent. And when they finally left this world years apart, because neither could bear to leave the other alone for long, they left behind a legacy far more valuable than gold. They left behind a family that knew how to listen, how to see, how to speak truth even when silence seemed safer, how to choose love even when fear seemed smarter. And in the end, that was the real treasure the mountain had given them. Not the gold that lay buried beneath 30 feet of snow and stone, but the understanding that the loudest things in life aren't gunshots or avalanches or desperate screams in the night. The loudest things are the truths we speak to the ones who matter. The promises we keep when keeping them is hard. The voices we find when the world has taught us that silence is survival. Abigail had spent 6 years silent to survive a monster. But she had broken that silence to save a good man, and in the breaking she had discovered that her voice was the most powerful weapon she possessed, more powerful than dynamite or rifles or all the gold in all the lost army payrolls that had ever disappeared into the American frontier, because her voice had saved not just Samuel's life, but her own. And in saving themselves, they had created something that would echo through generations, a family built on listening, on seeing, on speaking truth, on love that was loud enough to drown out even the roar of an avalanche,